You have no idea what it costs to raise a family in this economy, my son said, standing at the end of my kitchen table with his hands flat on the wood like he was about to push the whole thing over. Then his wife reached across and knocked my coffee mug straight off the counter with the back of her hand, ceramic shattering across the tile floor, while my youngest grandchild started crying in the next room. And here's the part that surprised everyone in that kitchen, including me. I didn't say a word. I just looked at the broken pieces on the floor, looked back up at the two of them, and said very quietly that I thought it was time for everyone to go home. What none of them understood was that I had already made 3 phone calls that week that they didn't know about. And those 3 calls had changed everything before a single mug ever hit the floor. My name is Raymond Kowalski. I am 67 years old. I spent 28 years working as an electrical engineer for a mid-sized contractor in Columbus, Ohio. And I retired 4 years ago with a clean pension, a paid-off house, and more free time than I honestly knew what to do with at first. My wife Dorothy passed away 2.5 years ago from complications after a stroke, and losing her the way I did, quickly and without enough warning, rearranged every assumption I had about what the next chapter of my life was supposed to look like. Dorothy was the one who kept track of everything. The holidays, the phone calls, the birthdays, the way she always knew when someone in the family was pulling away before anyone else could see it. Without her, I had to learn how to pay attention differently, and I did, eventually. I have 2 adult children. My son Kevin is 39, married to a woman named Brianna for 6 years, and they have 3 kids. Tyler, who is 8, Mia, who is 6, and the youngest, Cooper, who just turned 3. My daughter Susan is 42, lives in Portland with her husband and their teenage son, and she calls me every Sunday without fail, which I mention not to compare my kids, but because it matters later. Kevin and Brianna live about 25 minutes from my house in a neighborhood just east of Worthington, in a place they bought 5 years ago that was slightly more house than their budget comfortably supported, which I knew at the time because Kevin asked me to co-sign the mortgage, and I did, because Dorothy thought we should, and I trusted her instincts about our son, even when I had small doubts of my own. Things had been fine for a few years after that. Kevin and I would watch Ohio State games together on Saturdays when the season was running, and Brianna brought the kids over most Sunday afternoons. And I got to be the grandfather who had a big backyard with a tire swing and a freezer full of ice cream bars, which suited me just fine. But about 14 months before Thanksgiving of last year, something started shifting. It was subtle at first, the kind of thing you notice but talk yourself out of because you don't want to be the suspicious old man who sees problems everywhere. Kevin started mentioning money more often. Not asking directly, just mentioning. The car payment had gone up. The property taxes in Worthington were getting ridiculous. Brianna's hours at her job had been cut, and the timing was terrible, with Cooper still in daycare. I listened. I offered what felt reasonable. I bought the kids' school supplies and covered the co-pays when Cooper had a bad ear infection that ran into a second appointment. And every time I helped, the mention of money came back a little sooner than the last time, a little less casually, like a door being nudged open a little further each visit. About 8 months before that Thanksgiving, Brianna's parents, a couple named Doug and Patricia Mercer, came up in conversation for the first time. I had met them twice over the years, once at Kevin and Brianna's wedding, once at Tyler's birthday party when he turned 5. They were pleasant enough, people, retired, living in a house outside Dayton that they had owned for a long time. What I didn't know then was that Doug had made some significant financial decisions over the previous few years that hadn't gone the way he hoped, and that by the spring before Thanksgiving, they were looking at the very real possibility of losing that Dayton house and having nowhere clear to go. I found out about this in pieces, first from Kevin mentioning offhandedly that Doug's retirement savings had taken a hit, then from Brianna saying something at the kids' soccer game about her parents probably having to downsize dramatically. Then, about 6 weeks before Thanksgiving, Kevin sat down with me in my living room after the kids had gone to the backyard and told me what he was really building toward. He wanted to know if I would consider letting Doug and Patricia move into my house for a period of time. Not permanently, he said, just until they could figure out their next step. I had 2 spare bedrooms upstairs, Dorothy's old sewing room and the guest room where Susan stayed when she visited. He said it made sense practically, and that family helps family, and that he knew Dorothy would have wanted me to help. The mention of Dorothy in that context sat wrong with me in a way I couldn't fully articulate in the moment. I told Kevin I would think about it, and I meant that, but I also picked up the phone 2 days later and called my attorney, a careful and thorough woman named Margaret Ellison, who had helped me handle Dorothy's estate and update my own will in the months after the funeral. I told Margaret what Kevin had asked and what I was noticing, and she told me something that I want every father and grandfather hearing this story to remember. She said that emotional pressure, even when it comes from the people you love most, is still pressure. And that before I answered anyone about anything involving my home or my finances, I needed to make sure my own position was protected completely. We made a plan. I called it, privately, just to myself, getting my house in order, which felt appropriate for reasons that went beyond the legal paperwork. Thanksgiving came on a cold, gray Thursday, the kind of Columbus November that makes you understand why people move to Florida. I had cleaned the house the 2 days before, bought a turkey bigger than I needed, made Dorothy's cornbread dressing from her handwritten recipe card that still had a small grease stain in the upper corner from some long ago kitchen afternoon with her. Some things you keep doing not because they're practical, but because stopping them would mean something you're not ready for it to mean. Kevin and Brianna arrived with the kids around noon, and Doug and Patricia pulled up about 30 minutes later in a car I didn't recognize, a newer model than I expected given what Kevin had told me about their finances. I noticed that, but didn't say anything. Patricia came in carrying a store-bought pie and complimented everything in the house that wasn't nailed down. The floors, the window trim, the built-in bookshelves in the living room that Dorothy and I had installed the summer before she got sick. Cooper ran to me immediately and held both arms up, and I picked him up and carried him around for a while and forgot about everything else for a little while, the way grandchildren have a way of making you do. Dinner went smoothly for the first hour. Turkey and dressing and the green bean casserole Brianna always brought, and sweet potatoes with the little marshmallows on top that the kids loved. Dorothy's good china out on the table the way it always was for holidays, because some habits from a long marriage don't ask permission before they show up again. Patricia asked me thoughtful questions about my engineering career. Doug talked about college football. Kevin poured wine for the adults and made sure everyone's glass stayed full, more attentive than usual in a way I recognized as something other than just good hosting instincts. It was Patricia who shifted the conversation, and she did it gently enough that someone not paying close attention might have thought it was accidental. She said the house felt so warm and lived in, and that it must be strange sometimes rattling around in all this space by myself. I said something simple back, agreed that it was a bigger house than one person technically needed, and watched Kevin glance at Brianna across the table, the same way a person glances at a co-author to make sure they're ready. Doug cleared his throat and started talking about the Lions game instead, and I remember thinking very clearly, here it comes. It was Kevin who said it out loud, after the dishes had been cleared and the kids were watching something in the den. He leaned forward with his elbows on the table and looked at me with an expression I recognized from when he was 19 and needed something he wasn't sure I would give him. He said that with everything going on for Doug and Patricia, and with my house having the room, he just wanted to put the idea on the table. Not to pressure me, just to raise it as a possibility. Family takes care of family, Dad, he said. That's what you always taught me. I set down my coffee cup, and I told him that I appreciated him saying that, and that I did believe family takes care of family, which was exactly why I had co-signed his mortgage 6 years ago, and why I had been helping with the kids' expenses for the better part of a year and a half. And I told him, as clearly and as calmly as I could, that my home was mine, that the spare rooms were mine to use as I chose, and that I was not comfortable with what he was describing. Brianna's expression changed the way weather changes in Ohio, fast and without much warning. She told me I was being unreasonable, that her parents were in a genuinely difficult situation, and that I had more than enough space to help without it costing me anything real. I told her I understood her parents were struggling and that I had sympathy for that, but that my house was not a solution to a problem that wasn't mine to solve. I also said, and I want to be honest, that this was the part that changed the temperature in the room, that I thought perhaps the more natural question was whether Kevin and Brianna's own house had room to offer, since Doug and Patricia were her parents, not mine. Kevin stood up. Not fast the way Arthur's son Brian did, but slowly, which was somehow worse, the deliberate kind of standing up that means a person has been planning what they're about to say. He told me I had always made things about myself, that I had never really stepped up the way a father should, that Dorothy used to say I was difficult to reach, and that she had been right. He said the words with a level of calm that told me he had been holding them for a long time. I don't have words precise enough to explain what it feels like to have your dead wife used as evidence against you at your own Thanksgiving table. Dorothy, who had loved me imperfectly the way I had loved her imperfectly, who had never once said anything like what Kevin was describing, being invoked to make me feel ashamed of protecting myself in my own home. I stayed seated, I breathed. 30 years of working in rooms full of people who disagreed about things with real money attached had taught me that the person who stays calm the longest usually ends up with the clearest view of what actually happened. And then Brianna reached across behind her and knocked my coffee mug off the counter with the back of her hand. Whether it was intentional or whether it was the product of her swinging her arm wide while she was angry, I genuinely don't know, and I'm not sure it matters. Cooper heard the crash and started crying from the other room. Patricia looked at the broken pieces on the floor and then looked at me, and I could see on her face that she was embarrassed, that she had not come to my house expecting this. And I believed that then, and I believe it now. I told everyone very quietly that I thought it was time to go home. I did not raise my voice. I did not accuse anyone directly. Kevin looked at me and said I was overreacting, that it was just a mug, that I needed to stop being dramatic. I told him the mug was the least of it, picked up Cooper from the doorway where he had wandered in looking confused and frightened, held him for a moment, and handed him to Patricia. Then I walked to the front door, held it open, and waited. They left without finishing the conversation, which was not how Kevin had expected the evening to go. I know that because he called me 4 times before he got home, and twice more that night, and once at 7 in the morning the next day. I did not answer any of those calls. Instead, I sat in Dorothy's reading chair by the window with a cup of tea that went cold while I thought about what I needed to do next. And then I called Margaret Ellison at the number she had told me to use whenever something moved from preparation into necessity. I want to explain what Margaret and I had already done, because this is the part people always wonder about in situations like mine, and I think it deserves a clear answer. In the weeks after Kevin first raised the idea about Doug and Patricia, and after Margaret advised me to get my affairs fully in order before answering anyone about anything, we had done 3 specific things. First, I had removed Kevin as the primary beneficiary on my estate and restructured everything into a trust for the 3 grandchildren, Tyler, Mia, and Cooper, to be administered by Margaret and accessed for education and health costs when each child reached adulthood, fully outside Kevin and Brianna's control. Second, I had contacted the bank that held Kevin's mortgage, the one I had co-signed 6 years ago, and quietly begun the process of petitioning to have my name removed from that co-signing arrangement now that Kevin had sufficient equity and income history to stand behind the loan on his own. The bank confirmed this was possible with Kevin's cooperation, which Kevin did not yet know would be required. Third, I had put together a folder of documentation going back 18 months. Every transfer, every gift, every covered copay, organized clearly with dates and amounts, because Margaret said that a clear record of generosity made before any conflict is one of the most useful things a person can have when someone later tries to claim you were never there for your family. None of this was revenge. All of it was simply finishing what I should have done the morning after Dorothy's funeral, when the paperwork felt too heavy to lift, and I told myself I had time. The day after Thanksgiving, Kevin showed up at my door without calling first. He stood on the porch, looking tired in a way that wasn't just from bad sleep, and I let him in because he was my son, and because whatever had gone wrong between us had not started that Thursday. It had started slowly, over a long period, and ending it abruptly on a porch in November felt wrong, in a way I couldn't justify. We sat at the kitchen table with fresh coffee, and he apologized for what he said about Dorothy. He said it the way you say something you immediately knew was wrong the second it came out, with a kind of quiet horror at yourself that is different from regular regret. I told him I accepted that apology, and I meant it, but that I also needed him to understand that accepting an apology was not the same thing as nothing having changed. I told him about the trust I had set up for the grandchildren, and I watched his face move through several things at once. Surprise. Then something that looked like embarrassment. Then a careful neutrality that told me he understood the implications, even without me explaining them directly. I also told him that if he and Brianna wanted to invite Doug and Patricia to stay in their own home, I thought that was a generous and meaningful thing to do, and I would support it in whatever small ways I reasonably could from the outside. I would bring meals occasionally. I would help with the grandchildren's schedules if that freed up some of the pressure at their house. What I would not do was open my home to people I barely knew, because the alternative was feeling guilty at my own table. Kevin was quiet for a long time. Then he asked whether I was going to withdraw from the mortgage co-signing, and I told him that process was already in motion, that it was not punitive, and that his equity and history now made it entirely possible without affecting his loan terms. He said that felt like a punishment, regardless of how I framed it. I told him I understood why it felt that way, and that I hoped over time he would also understand why I had done it. Brianna called me 3 days later. The conversation was shorter and more difficult than the one with Kevin. She told me I had humiliated her parents by making them feel unwelcome, that I had made a hard situation harder, and that she didn't understand how someone could have all that space and all that security and still look his family in the eye and say no. I listened to all of it without interrupting. And then I said something I had been thinking about since Thanksgiving Thursday, which was that I had noticed for the better part of a year and a half that my home and my finances had been something other people were measuring and planning around without asking me how I felt about being measured and planned around. And that the word selfish is often used by people who are disappointed that someone else's generosity has a limit, and that having a limit is not the same thing as being selfish. It is simply being a person. She didn't respond to that directly. The call ended shortly after. My daughter Susan called me from Portland that same week, after Kevin had apparently called her looking for an ally. I expected her to push me toward compromise the way older siblings sometimes do. Instead, she said, "Dad, you don't have to explain yourself to me. I know you. And I know Dorothy would have had that paperwork done years ago if she'd been the one left behind." Which made me laugh for the first time since that Thursday, a real laugh, long enough that Susan asked if I was okay, and I told her I was better than I'd been in a while, actually. Doug and Patricia, as I learned through Kevin over the following months, did eventually move in with Kevin and Brianna. It was tight, and not always easy from what Kevin let slip during our gradual conversations, but it also turned out to be possible, which had been my point all along. There had always been a solution to their situation that didn't require my house. It had simply been easier to ask me first, because asking me came without the daily complications of actually sharing a roof with your own family. I understood that dynamic without judgment. Housing is hard and families are complicated, and nobody makes their best decisions under financial pressure. But understanding something doesn't mean absorbing it as your responsibility when it isn't. Kevin and I have been rebuilding carefully since November. He comes by on his own about twice a month now, sometimes with the kids, sometimes without. And we talk the way fathers and sons talk when they've stopped pretending everything is fine and started figuring out what fine actually means for them going forward. He hasn't asked me to reverse the trust or rejoin the mortgage. I think he understands now that those decisions weren't about punishing him. They were about me finally doing, clearly and completely, what a person does when they realize the people who love them have also been, without fully meaning to, treating their security as something communal rather than something personal. The guest room upstairs is exactly as it was. Susan's toiletries still on the bathroom shelf from her visit in October. Tyler's drawings from last Christmas taped to the inside of the closet door because he asked me to save them, and I did. Those rooms belong to the people who should be in them, and they are ready for those people whenever they come. I planted Dorothy's spring bulbs in the front yard last week, the tulips and the daffodils she used to do herself every October, so they'd come up in April. The neighbor's dog sat at the fence and watched me the whole time like I was doing something worth supervising. And I thought about her, the way I do whenever I'm doing something with my hands, and I thought that she would have handled all of this better and faster than I did, because she always saw people more clearly than I gave her credit for. But I also think she would have told me I got there eventually, which is the most you can ask of anyone. I never wanted to be the father who kept score, or the grandfather who withheld himself over money and pride. I still don't want that. What I wanted, what I have always wanted, was to be treated like a person whose home and whose peace and whose choices belong to him, not a resource, not a building with empty bedrooms. A person, if you are a grandfather or a grandmother watching this and you have felt that quiet measuring look from the people around your table, the one that turns your living room into square footage and your savings into a question of availability rather than your own security, I want you to know that protecting yourself is not the same as failing your family. It is sometimes the only way to stay whole enough to keep showing up for them in the ways that actually matter. And sometimes the most loving thing you can do for the people at your table is make sure they understand, clearly and early, that love and access are not the same thing. If this story meant something to you, I'd love to hear from you, neighbor. Drop a comment below and tell me where you're watching from. And if you've been through something like this yourself, or if someone in your family has, I want to hear that, too. Hit that like button if this story stayed with you, and subscribe because there are more stories coming, and every one of them is real.